So 2016 is over, a lot of terrible shit happened, and now, to top it all off, we have an Oompa Loompa to lead the country. But hey, this isn't a politics channel, and it never will be. And believe it or not, there were some good things to happen in 2016, and there certainly were some very good movies to come out. So without further ado, here are my 15 favorite movies of 2016. Starting at number 15 is the gritty and filthy Green Room, guaranteed to both thrill and revolt the senses with its brutal violence and seedy atmosphere. Director Jeremy Saulnier knows how to create action that feels realistic and loves putting large guns and rusty blades into the hands of totally incompetent characters, where the resulting entropy is both fun and extremely anxiety-inducing, yet absolutely worth your time, if you think you can handle it. I'm giving number 14 to a charming little indie film that is both quirky and really funny, with elements of comedy, drama, and magical realism, The Fits. At only a little over an hour long, the movie explores a luxury of thought-provoking topics and gradually sculpts its fascinating lead character, Tony, who is extremely likable here and played incredibly well by Royalty Hightower. Directed by Anna Rose Holmer, The Fits is one of the most peculiar and clever indies of 2016, and I look forward to seeing what this writer-director comes out with next. At number 13, I have to recognize a movie that sadly went under the radar for a lot of people. I think because when they saw the trailer or the advertisements, they just assumed that it was this cliched buddy cop comedy story, which I don't blame them. It did have that appearance, and it almost kind of is, but also happens to be extremely original and amazing in its own right. The Nice Guys. This flick is loaded with some goofy humor, which felt both at times a bit puerile and also surprisingly clever in places. But either way, it always got me laughing and was a really cool new take on the buddy comedy and LA noir genres. For number 12, I have to recognize an indie that managed to separate audiences this year into either the love it or hate it categories. A movie that I reviewed a few months ago and mentioned how the final act was really terrible, but doesn't detract from the sweet brilliance of its first two-thirds. I'm talking about Swiss Army Man, a wacky, hilarious, and surprisingly moving rumination on male adolescence and the simple joys of growing up as a 90s kid. The effects and production value here and soundtrack are just off the charts, especially considering its indie roots, and the laughs are relentless. In 11th place, I have the ultra-dark French indie film Evolution. A lot of people have mentioned how reminiscent to Under the Skin this movie is, both thematically and stylistically, and I'd have to agree. Evolution is moody and eerie all throughout, a movie that feels a bit out of reach in terms of categorization and labels. The film takes place on a mysterious island, or just entirely different planet for all we know, where its only inhabitants are young women and what you assume are their male children, both groups sharing a dubious connection that becomes progressively more suspicious, especially for the film's protagonist, Nicholas, who begins to investigate his purpose on the island with some devastating consequences. Filled to the brim with beautiful, haunting imagery and plenty of philosophical heft to argue with your friends over, Evolution is one of the most eerie art house sci-fis of the year. My number 10 goes to an animated film that I was anticipating for a very long time that just looked so original and so gorgeous to me. Kubo and the Two Strings. I was so afraid that the stop animation was going to be too smooth so as to defeat the purpose of making it in such a way. But amazingly, all those little jitters and skips retain their noticeable charm here, and no matter how achingly beautiful it all gets, it still always feels like you're looking at physical objects that are manipulated by human hands. Kubo contains a wonderful story with some gorgeous environments and apparently some of the largest physical puppets in any stop-motion film ever. This next movie at number 9 looked so incredibly cheesy to me. I remember seeing the advertisements and just thinking I would never see it. But my dad talked me into going to see it with him, and I actually ended up being pretty happy with it. I'm talking about Hell or High Water. There's just something about this movie. Maybe it's the characters or the writing or the incredible spurts of action that pop out of nowhere. Maybe it's a combination of all those, but I think what really put me over the edge was the final scene, a snippet of dialogue between two of the lead characters, a moment that kind of solidified the entire experience for me and revealed it to be the mature and emotional work of art it actually is. My 8th favorite movie of 2016 is from one of my favorite directors currently working, who did a film a few years ago that I loved called Take Shelter, and another movie in 2016 called Loving that came out later that year. But this slot goes to his indie sci-fi film Midnight Special. Now, I know some people who saw this and were partially underwhelmed and complained that there wasn't enough action, which is odd to me because I think the original trailer gave strong hints of exactly what was in store, which was basically a hard sci-fi drama. The movie is clever and artfully crafted with some really surprising and memorable scenes throughout. A minimalist brand of sci-fi that only focuses on the bare essentials, ultimately leading to a beautiful conclusion. At number 7, I have a movie that I think will continue to challenge genre labels and categorization, something that managed to combine a really artistic sensibility with some just great horror gags, and by its end, just sheer visceral terror. I'm talking about The Witch. Is this horror, drama, art house? Personally, I think it's fair to call it horror, but just an unusual brand, I suppose, which is a big part of what I like about it. And it's precisely this artistic feel that makes the film all that more impressionable and thereby unsettling. At number 6, I have for you guys a really bizarre erotic thriller. I guess all erotic thrillers are kind of weird in their own way, but this puppy just sets an entirely new standard. And not only that, but just felt so vast and epic that by the time it was over, it just felt like you had come so far. I'm referring to Chan Wook Park's The Handmaiden. I think this is his best film, and I know how hard it is to beat something like Oldboy, but holy shit, what a strange and fascinating journey this movie is. Watch the original trailer and nothing else, and then just give it a shot. So, for the last 4 years, we've had an amazing, massive sci-fi film to come out each year. 2013 gave us the awe-inspiring Gravity, while in 2014, Christopher Nolan pulled out all the stops with his slightly clunky, but otherwise beautiful and epic space opera Interstellar, to then leave us with a very warmly received The Martian from Ridley Scott in 2015. Our filmmakers are on a roll here, and I would love for them to continue this trend, especially if we can keep getting this kind of talent behind the camera each time. I think my wish could come true because Blade Runner is set to release next year, and holy shit, that teaser just gave me chills. Denis Villeneuve is directing it as well, which is very promising, especially considering his solid filmography so far, which just so happens to include my 4th favorite movie of the year, a sharp-as-hell sci-fi drama, Arrival. Smart and smooth as glass, Arrival was one of the most intellectually playful films of the year and incredibly entertaining to watch its narrative twist around itself in all kinds of unexpected ways. At number 4, this is one of the most simultaneously funny and dismal movies I've seen in a very long time, The Lobster. This movie is definitely not for everyone, and probably the most difficult flick on this list to recommend. But for the patient, open-minded viewer, this is a potentially life-changing amalgamation of humor and philosophy, violence and romance, something that on the surface seems to be extraordinarily bleak, but actually might be hiding one of the most life-affirming messages I've personally seen in a movie. At number 3, I want to mention a movie that I was anticipating for an extremely long time, and just is so devastating and deadly serious and emotionally heavy. So if you're into that kind of serious, hardcore shit, then this is definitely something that you'll appreciate. This movie is so cool because it follows the life of one man and is separated into 3 chapters. The first, which looks at his childhood, the second, which looks at his adolescence, and then the final chapter looking at his adulthood. The movie I'm referring to is called Moonlight. I'm pretty confident that this film will win the Academy Award for Best Picture, or at least that's been my prediction for many months now, and the hype doesn't seem to be quelling in the slightest. If that surprises you to hear me say that, then I just suggest that you see it, because the epic breadth of its narrative and sincere examination of a single man's life is really impressive and rewarding. I think this movie is a masterwork worthy of any and all praise it might receive, and a deeply honest and heartfelt piece of cinema. And even though it might not be my number one of 2016, I still love the absolute shit out of it and would be proud to see it win this year, if in fact it does. And if it doesn't win, it's only probably because my number 2 pick will, La La Land. There were about 5 moments in La La Land that caused my eyes to just well up momentarily. I didn't cry exactly, but I was so unexpectedly overwhelmed by emotion and a countless number of scenes, because damn me to hell if this isn't the sweetest, most charming movie I seriously have ever seen. Emma Stone steals the show here. She is so cool in every scene and totally won me over, while Ryan Gosling is a perfect match and gives one of his best performances. Damien Chazelle, who also wrote and directed Whiplash, has given us a musical with the ability to win over even the most unflinching opponents of this genre. So if you avoided La La Land because you think stuff like West Side Story and Chicago are just too cheesy, I still urge you to give it a chance. At first you might be wondering why you're even doing so, because don't get me wrong, it is still most certainly a musical in every sense. But it's also an extremely unique take on the genre, and for me, far more entertaining than just about all of the others, with an incredible story and wonderful romance, amazing performances, and some beautiful cinematography. La La Land is an absolute knockout. So finally, at number 1 is a movie that, simply put, just impressed me the most and just hit me the hardest out of anything that I saw this year, and is one of the more convincing recreations of real life that I've seen from a film in a very long time. Manchester by the Sea. Casey Affleck plays the doomed and perpetually disconsolate Lee Chandler, a plumber who seems to have just been swallowed up whole by apathy and grief. Early on in the film, we find out that his brother has died and had intended for Chandler to become the legal guardian of the son he left behind in case anything happened. And as you can probably already guess, Affleck's character doesn't quite want responsibility over his nephew. This movie is just so marvelously about life itself, real, gritty life. And don't get me wrong though, I love my escapist cinema too. And even though I don't really review a lot of the bigger mainstream treats here on The Grain, I still get a kick out of shit like Rogue One, for example, which I happen to pay to see in the theater twice. So give me all your Fantastic Beasts, all your Doctor Stranges, throw me all the little hobbits you can. But the shit that truly melts my mind and makes it hard for me to get up out of my seat afterwards, the stuff that overwhelms me, are the films that put every ounce of energy they have into representing the richness of everyday life and exploring the minds of characters along with the way they interact with one another.
Sir, you're out of order. Out of order? I show you out of order.
In this way, Manchester by the Sea is arguably the truest kind of movie magic that there is, just because of how convincingly real the experience feels. There's something almost voyeuristic to it as you're watching these characters that feel like real people having real conversations that otherwise they normally wouldn't want you to listen in on. A lot of movies work their hardest to get your attention with grandiose stunts or action set pieces, whereas Manchester is totally comfortable casting its gaze deep within the perfunctory habits and routines of the everyday human being. It's fascinating as hell though because of how deep it manages to burrow into the individual psychologies of each character, all of which feel incredibly lifelike and multidimensional. Sure, it's slow, of course it's slow, but I mean, by today's standards, just about any movie that doesn't feature a giant robot stomping through Manhattan or some shit is usually going to be deemed slow by some audiences. So who gives a shit? Slow is not necessarily synonymous with boring. In fact, in this case, I felt that this slower, deliberate kind of pace was extremely interesting. I didn't want it to end, actually. I could just practically watch these characters live out the rest of their lives. And while, yes, the subject matter is pretty dark, it's still not the sort of thing that you walk out of the theater feeling like a sack of shit or something. The dialogue is just too rich, and the cinematography of the seaside and the snow-covered town is just too beautiful, and the story too goddamn deep for me to just shove it aside because it's a little sad. But if you don't get excited about things like character development or extensive scenes of dialogue or drama, then I guess Manchester by the Sea just probably wouldn't be your cup of tea. But in my opinion, those movie elements are worth getting excited for, simply just because of how hard they strive to represent real human experience. I mean, I think most of us know a thing or two about heartbreak and loss, as well as love and forgiveness. And I think this movie just simply wants to remind us of the fact that we're all in this together. Nobody is completely free of struggle, and tragedy doesn't necessarily have to lead all the way to despair. 30 years from now, this movie will live up, in part because its appeal doesn't hinge on the latest state of technology or computer-generated imagery, and even more so just because of how authentic it feels, along with its wisdom about life and loss and love. Give it a chance, because even after many decades have passed, I think we'll find we still have something valuable to learn from movies like Manchester by the Sea.